Town of St. Andrews special meeting of council, an electronic meeting on Tuesday, May the 19th, 2020 at approximately 2 p.m. Recording of attendance, I note that all members of council are in attendance with the exception of Councillor Henderson, who previously advised us that he may not be able to attend this afternoon.
Mayor, that is not Henderson, it's Harrison.
Oh, sorry, Harrison, pardon me, I misspoke. Thank you, Councillor Akaji.
I'm here in body.
Yeah, you are definitely here. I can see you. So I will now look for a motion to approve the agenda, please.
Also move.
Okay, thank you. And a seconder?
I'll second that.
Okay, thank you. All in favor of approving the agenda, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing nay, hearing none, the agenda is approved. I will now move to disclosure of conflict of interest. Hearing none from anyone, we will move on. We will go to a presentation. The primary purpose of this afternoon's meeting is to hear a presentation from Alexander Gogan, our planner, and Alexander Henderson, the Director of Planning for the Southwest New Brunswick Service Commission, presenting in relation to the Municipal Plan MP 20-01, the Secondary Municipal Plan MP 20-02, and the Zoning Bylaw. I also will note that we have our Chief Administrative Officer and Treasurer, Chris Spear, and our Clerk and Director and Manager of Administration, Paul Knopper, on with us as well. So we will now turn the floor over to, I believe, Mr. Gogan.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. The way that I think it makes the most sense to do these presentations, because they're on 3 different bylaws, which are at 3 different points in council's agenda, I guess, is to start with the municipal plan, do that presentation, allow for questions and discussion, then do the secondary municipal plan, allow for questions, discussion, and then hopefully we can get to the zoning bylaw. They're all fairly short presentations.
Okay, that makes sense to me, Mr. Gogan. Does anyone else agree or have any objection to that approach? Okay, thank you. Carry on, Mr. Gogan.
All right, so I will share my screen and we'll get started. So starting with the municipal plan. So what's happened so far, we've had 2 public hearings. I think the last one was March 26th, so a little less than a month ago. And at that public hearing and leading up to it, we heard that there are still concerns over private land. And concerns were voiced that if there is a buffer, it should apply uniformly, and that the zoning implications should be known now and not only when the zoning bylaw comes into effect. So staff's initial recommendation was that the buffer should apply uniformly. So that certainly, from staff's point of view, is not an issue. And we've done a little bit of work to have zoning drafts that have that language incorporated into it. And I'll go over that in this presentation and the zoning presentation. It wasn't just the waterfront owners group that we heard from in regards to the entire coastline being regulated. It was other residents of town as well. So it's not just from that group that we're hearing that. So the changes, this first policy, it's really, the changes in yellow are just about strengthening and making it unambiguous that private property is private property. Frankly, it's not, from a planning point of view, it's not necessary to be this defined about it, but it doesn't affect the policy. It doesn't weaken it. It doesn't strengthen it, it just makes it clearer, which I know was a concern that was expressed, that these should be clear. So that's that change. And then the second change would make this limited development buffer area extend around the whole coastline, including Water Street. This proposal would no longer be necessary because it's addressed in the policy. And these are the sort of general zoning implications. So that 20-meter setback that currently is there becomes 30 meters, and that's based on every best practice, including the coastal area protection policy. And it would set terms and conditions in the zoning bylaw, and I'll get to that, I believe, on the next slide. Some residential properties that are currently zoned green space, if you think of the current zoning map, there is a buffer in some areas of green space that would go away, but the general provision would prevail. And it's staff's belief, and through looking at best practices, that there can be low impact responsible development within this 30-meter zone that doesn't negatively impact environment or aesthetics. And so here's what here's what we've currently drafted in terms of the zoning bylaw. So again, you've got 30 meters of the ordinary high water mark or of Katie's Cove. And there are exemptions for this, but they're in part 2. But remember, there are exemptions. So any development requires an environmental protection plan prepared by a geotechnical engineer or other professional engineer to adequately control potential runoff, erosion, and sedimentation caused by development. No on-site septic systems within that 30 meters. And part of those are within 30 meters of Katie's Cove. So that's an area where you definitely don't want to see septic tanks placed, and that's not serviced, whereas most of the 30 meter, at least around Water Street, that would all be serviced, so not an issue. Shall accept for the removal of individual trees which pose a reasonable risk to the safety of life or property. Preserve a minimum of 75% of all existing trees or shrubs within the 30-meter setback. So that's existing trees. It's not saying you have to have 75% tree cover on your lot. It's just saying for what's there. And now here are the exemptions. So any accessory structure under 600 square feet, basically a development permit structure that isn't designed for overnight accommodation. So a gazebo. There's some other things that I'll mention in a minute. Repairs, change of use alterations that aren't increasing the floor area. So if you have a property, a building in this 30-meter setback, you can still do work on it as long as you're not increasing the floor area. That wouldn't require engineered plans or anything like that. If you're doing ramps, stairs, decks, unpaved car parking areas, things that wouldn't have a great impact on erosion and runoff anyways, those are exempt. There's some accessory uses, recreational, scientific, academic things that are allowed in the ESA zone. Shore protection works, that's something we heard people saying, you know, we want to be able to prevent further erosion, and that's very reasonable. So there's only one type of shore protection work that is strongly recommended against through best practices, and those are rigid structures that are built out from the shoreline. There aren't any currently in St. Andrews, but they can cause significant problems for neighboring properties. So they shouldn't be used. So that's included in a definition. And a public utility use, so if there's road work that needs to be done, work on the Katie's Cove gates, those kinds of things would also be exempt, so it doesn't get in the way of kind of normal operating business. I did a quick little map of what that 30-meter limited development buffer would encompass. So you can see there are a lot of properties on Water Street that are currently in that area, and if they need to make changes or repairs, as long as the floor area isn't getting bigger, they wouldn't need anything special. Almost all of these properties, the ones on Water Street, have been developed. There's only one or two exceptions, and one of those is too small to really be developed anyways. One of them is 131 Water Street, which hopefully will be developed before this comes into effect. And the future land use map looks a little different because that coastal conservation overlay that was obviously along the coast, that's been removed. It doesn't have to be mapped. And just to sort of get ahead of some potential questions and concerns, will this make development more onerous and expensive on Water Street? So you have to remember that there is currently an outright prohibition on development within 20 meters. And that can be varied, but the variance process can be long and expensive, and you can end up in the same place as we would sort of have people end up without having to go through that. So I looked back through PAC minutes, and Cottage Craft would certainly have been in this 20 meters, and they had to go through, I think, 3 or 4, possibly 5 meetings, and they had to get engineered plans. So if they were to apply again with these new policies, they would get to the same place, but they wouldn't have to go through the variance process. And you would have the same level of environmental protection. As I mentioned, there's very few undeveloped properties. And if you're doing, little things that aren't habitable, then this wouldn't affect you. Another potential concern, are you going to lose the distinction between the kind of downtown maritime village feel that you have on Water Street and the kind of more country estate that you have as you go further up the peninsula? And I think this mostly relates to tree planting. So again, we're not saying you have to plant trees, you have to cover 75% of your land with trees. It's just you're not removing what's there to that 75% level. So if you've already cleared your lot, like the lots on Water Street, which are mostly cleared, they can stay cleared. So you still see the buildings, you still have that maritime village. And in terms of a timeline, there's 2 options at this point. If council wants to go with these recommendations and these changes, we would have to do another public hearing. We would have to request views of PRAC again. That could be done at the June 1st regular meeting. The public hearing could occur on June 22nd, and the 3rd reading could happen on July 6th. Option number 2, you stick with what you've got now. So that's the coastal conservation overlay, which does not include Water Street. And you've already done the public hearing, you've gotten views of PRAC. So you can just do a 3rd reading within 6 months of the last public hearing, which would be by October 26th, although I think ideally that would be sooner. So that's the municipal plan. And I can go back to that. If people want to see close-ups of maps, I can pull those up too. But happy to take questions or just have discussion at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Gopin. Council, questions?
Your worship,
Yes?
just a question for Mr. Gopin is, I seem to recall that we have to pass 3rd reading within 6 months of doing the 1st reading. Is that correct?
I'm pretty sure it's within 6 months of the public hearing.
Yeah, Your Worship, if I could,
Certainly.
the Community Planning Act states that it's from the date of the public hearing. So, or the latest, we can go off the latest public hearing that was held, and then there's a 6-month calculation off that.
Your Worship,
Yes, Deputy Mayor.
would this be determined a substantial change though? Because we've had a hearing of objections where this 30-meter zone wasn't on certain property owners, and now it is. So we've kind of announced that after a hearing of objections. So I'm wondering if there's any concerns over
Your worship, if I may,
Yes, you may.
I would consider this a substantial change. So that's why in that first option, we are doing views of PrAC again. We are doing another public hearing. So those would be required. But if nothing changes, then you can go straight to third reading.
Anyone else with a question?
I have another question, Your Worship,
Certainly.
is looking at the generalized future land use map on Katie's Cove, there are 2 lots that are owned by the town. Would it be a real trouble to change those to green space or environmental versus residential? Because right now it looks like they're residential, but I think the general intent is that that's street and park, really.
You're, if I may,
Certainly.
I believe you're referring to the 2 smallest properties there, right? As you sort of get
Yeah.
to the end of the road. Yeah, those could definitely be green space.
Yeah. I think that would be very, that would be wise to change it to green space right now and in the planning so that it's preserved as green space for future generations. That's just my 2 cents worth, I guess.
I think we did discuss that briefly one time before, and I thought we had agreed to that.
Yeah.
Council, if anyone else wants to weigh in, that's fine, but otherwise, I do recall that myself, that, and we will still have the opportunity to debate that at a later stage of this, so put it in the draft, and it will go out for public consultation as well, so if we make that change, so I think we should go ahead and do that, unless anyone on council strenuously objects. Okay, Mr. Gubin, can we add that to the list?
It is added. I'll make those changes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, good. Mr. Gubin, what's next for us?
Secondary municipal plan. So we'll go on to another presentation. I'll share my screen if I can figure out how to do that. So this is mostly a refresher presentation. I've essentially given it before to council and to the public, but I know it's been a while, and not just in actual time, but in perceived time. So it's definitely worth going over it again. And there's one change since the last version council has seen. But I'll try and get through the not so important parts quickly. So architectural heritage and quality design are economic drivers for the town, as I'm sure you all know. Residents take pride in the design features of their home, and there's also a collective pride in the town. People are obviously proud to live in St. Andrews, in a town that values its history and has such a wonderful aesthetic as much as St. Andrews does. And that's beyond the town has been recognized by Parks Canada, by the Canadian Institute of Planners. And these design issues are addressed in Section 9 of the current zoning bylaw. And we really tried to stick with those, but that section has been very challenging to administer. And in some ways it buries a lot of very important information in a document that not a lot of people really want to get into. So the design manual, as you'll see, as maybe you remember, it's a much more visual educational document that focuses not only on regulations, but also on best practices. So this is the map, and there was a bit of discussion, and eventually we came to it will include properties on the other side of the street. The previous version had done that, but it had drawn a line. I don't know if it was 10 meters or 20 meters. And we really think it makes more sense just extend it through the whole property. Of course, properties can be removed from this if necessary. And for reference, we've now included as well the historic town plat, because the areas that are regulated don't align directly with that original 1786 town plat plan. But one of the reasons to include the areas, if you think about doing the loop, you come down, drive along Water Street, you're going to be also seeing properties on the other side of the street, and you do have, especially these properties here, those Maxwell houses, amazing examples of design and architecture, a little bit newer than some parts of the historic business district, but still very important historically. And just like the current one, we've distinguished between the historic business district in red here and the town plat. And it's the historic business district that really has the majority of the regulations. So as I've explained, this is a hybrid regulatory and educational document. Requirements are most in the HBD, a lot of best practices and more educational statements. It explains how various elements contribute to quality design in a user-friendly and visual manner. It is not a heritage conservation bylaw. There are recommendations in the municipal plan about investigating that again, but this is a very different document. It's really about quality design that fits in two contexts. So it isn't inherently about heritage, although of course if you have that context, that does need to be taken into account. But the approach we've taken with this document, and in general the approach we take with planning matters in the historic business district, is they should fit into the context. They shouldn't be directly replicating styles that already exist. And when you start looking at the existing buildings, if you do an architectural survey, you realize pretty quickly that you can't discreetly fit any building into an architectural style, and they actually borrow from past architectural styles. They're based on shipbuilding techniques. But over time, you get this layering of history and elements, and that's what people actually find aesthetically pleasing. A heritage conservation bylaw regulates demolition. This doesn't do that. This is about new builds and extensive renovations. And this also isn't about specific properties. So one concern that I think folks had with the heritage conservation bylaw is their property was identified by PID. This is about areas of town and the context that those areas create, not about specific properties. And this is just a sample of a page. I know you'll have the document in front of you, but it's just showing, like, this page is particularly educational. It's explaining some architectural theories of horizontal elements and vertical elements, and sort of why, if you look at the Berry block, why do you like the Berry block? And this kind of gets into that. And part of that was inspired by the Civic Trust and the work that they've done. So for requirements, just like in the zoning bylaw, where a development officer is looking at setbacks and height and those kinds of things, this would be very similar. The zoning bylaw still applies. So the zoning bylaw is usually more detailed, has specific numbers in it. But the design manual, again, is taking parts of the zoning bylaw. So it would function in a largely similar way for the requirements. But for best practices, there are education and information to be provided. They're obviously not requirements, but they could be through development agreements or terms and conditions on variances on a case-by-case basis. If they were seen as being that important, they could be incorporated as requirements. And this is just a sample of what it looks like, how the language looks different. We did workshop this a bit with council, and I think it's at a point where it's very clear that up here you've got best practices, and down here this is required, it is proposed, and again, proposal language is the language it has to be in as a secondary plan. I know there's some concern that saying it's proposed is wishy-washy, but that's really the legal language that has to be there. So what are the requirements for the historic business district? Entrances facing the street, minimal setbacks, buildings parallel or at right angles to streets or public spaces, building size fitting into context, transparency at ground level, rooftop mechanical systems incorporated in design or screened, exterior materials, cedar shakes, wooden clapboard, brick, stone, or adequate facsimiles. Materials have come a long way, and things like hardy board, this fiber cement board, really look exactly like cedar siding, but are much more durable, much more fire resistant. And wooden doors, height of awnings for accessibility, making sure that objects aren't blocking sidewalks. So there's a bit of public realm in this as well. No asphalt for pedestrian walkways to prevent runoff for stormwater management. Almost all of these are already in Section 9 of the zoning bylaw, so they're not moving goalposts. The only one that sort of falls into that is this materials. Now, Section 9 attempted to regulate materials, but it referred to the Civic Trust Handbook, which changed versions and stopped really talking about materials in a regulatory way. So that basically lapsed, and this would bring it back into regulation. So for the town plat and environs, entrances facing the street, buildings parallel or right angles to streets or public spaces, and the building size fitting into context. So that's essentially height and massing, which are already regulated in the zoning bylaw. So for most residents of town, this is very minimal. There are things that are already regulated by the zoning bylaw. And the only change we're proposing since council has seen this last, this is for the historic business district, and it's about building height. And initially it had been within a 10% tolerance of the average of main buildings on the same block. There was concern that that was a bit of a slippery slope, and you could do 10%, and then it's, oh, well, that one's 10%, we'll do 10% of that one, and then 10% of that one, and then you've got a 10-story building. A very simple solution to that is you cap it at 15 meters, which is the height of the Kennedy Inn, which is the tallest building in town. And this can't actually be varied because it's a secondary plan. It has to be amended by council. So that's staff's recommendation for how to allow contextual height in the historic business district, but not have it snowball and just sort of run out of control. So the timeline for this document, first reading has been given already. So we're at second reading. That could happen June 1st. Views of prac could be requested then, and the public hearing date could be set. June 29th, public hearing, and August 4th, third reading. And that is the presentation. So now I'm happy to take questions or hear discussion on this one.
Thank you, Mr. Goopin. Councilors, questions? Mr. Groom, Councilor Groom?
For Mr. Goopin, how difficult would it be to incorporate a section on demolition? I think that's an important element, and I think what you have here, you've got some really good bones here. But if we could, have a section on demolition so that we can control demolition through the secondary municipal plan, I think that would be a very positive step.
Xander, or Your Worship, if I could jump in there. I looked at this question as Councillor Grew has raised as pertained to the building bylaw with legal at one time, and the answer we got back was that there is, when it comes to regulating demolitions, other than standards that are under the National Building Code for safety and doing it safely, the only way you can prevent someone from demolishing a property is the mechanism for doing so is through the Heritage Conservation Bylaw, which this isn't. Now the question is whether or not, I think it's not something we could easily do, would be the question, or would be the answer to the question the councillor raised. It would require much more research, and I would propose that, you know, as it's standing in the current draft of the municipal plan to look at Heritage Conservation Bylaw, that would be the appropriate place to look at that.
Okay, thank you. So you're saying that the previous advice that you received was that that was the mechanism, and that are you saying that the case law is now telling us in Canada that anybody who owns a building can tear it down if they want to, and that the municipality can't do anything about that unless you have a heritage conservation bylaw that protects the specific building, I would assume?
Your worship, yeah, I did run this case example by our legal review, and our lawyer who works with the commission is he's a former planner and has worked in many different cases. So I do have great confidence in the advice that was given me on the matter of the building bylaw, where the building bylaw is the thing which regulates the actual construction activity, and if you can't prohibit demolition through that bylaw, I don't have a lot of confidence it would be possible through the secondary municipal plan. But I'm not prepared to say for certain it could not be done. I just suspect it would take, it would require us to go back to significant review and research. So again, I would suggest it's not something that could easily be done to quickly answer the question.
Okay. So we may have to park that and think about whether we want to go into that any further, council. And I take it from that, I'm just assuming from what you said briefly that we can't create a building bylaw that deals with demolition in any way different than what we have it now. Is that correct? That would be the prevailing legal opinion?
The thing is, people have a right to demolish their property and use their property, demolish structures on the property, sorry. But you can set standards as council about doing it safely through the building bylaw, because that's reflected in code. But where you would be making distinction, I think what Xander said was the key point, where you're making a distinction between this property and that property, like you can demolish, but you can't. And what basis would you be doing that on? You'd have to find a legal basis in which to do that. And one of those legal bases is the Heritage Conservation Bylaw, making heritage the sticking point. So that's basically, as far as I understand it, that you have to find your legal basis for which to prevent one versus another to do it.
Okay, thank you. Council, any other questions on that point or comments?
I have another question. Your work, is I noted that you in the document you're encouraging or banning, if you would, pedestrian walkways made out of asphalt. The entire Van Horn Trail is an asphalt trail. So there's a bit of an inconsistency there.
If I may, I think that section is only required in the historic business district, which wouldn't include the Van Horn Trail. And in the town plat, it's a recommendation, but obviously the Van Horn Trail is a separate thing. This is really for people's backyards. It's probably better to have gravel or something porous.
Mm-hmm. The challenge there I would put forth is that gravel is tends not to be accessibly friendly or age friendly.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't. You want a smooth surface and asphalt does provide that. So I'm not sure how we reconcile that.
Well, I guess so. Again, in the town plat, so for essentially the residential properties in town, it's a recommendation. So if for accessibility reasons people want to
Mhm.
use asphalt, that wouldn't be an issue. And I think, let me just check, but I think in the historic business district, it would be required, and that might be worth rethinking.
Yeah. Thank you.
May I just ask a question?
Yes, certainly.
If I owned an older property and I decided that I wanted to take down that older property and build a more up-to-date house, then I would be allowed to do that. And the only thing that could stop me from taking down this older property would be a heritage bylaw. Is that what you're saying?
Pretty much. Even that is, I think the property has to be specifically identified as a local historic place. So not every property in the town plat is designated that way.
Okay.
I think about 80 or 90 are. More could be, but basically, Councilor Bishop, that's correct. Yes.
Okay.
Your
Okay.
Worship, if
Well,
I may-
I'd just like to say one more thing. I kind of feel that if you own the property, you should have the right to do what you want to with it.
So, Your Worship, one more point, and I'll just food for thought, is correct me if I'm mistaken, the way I'm reading this is following up what Councillor Bishop said. If you decided to demolish your property and rebuild something new, there's no restrictions. If you decide to renovate your property, you run into all kinds of restrictions with the secondary municipal plan. Have I got that correct?
I would say.
No, I think it would basically be the same. You would be able to have the same requirements for major renovations that you would for a new build.
Okay,
And Your Worship, if I may,
Certainly.
the distinction between the Heritage Conservation Bylaw and the second municipal plan should be stated again. It is different, and I think as Councillor Group pointed out, it's recovering new development, which under Community Planning Act, it regulates new development. So structural alterations, changes of use, new structures, that's the purview of the Community Planning Act. Preserving structures from demolition, that's the purview of the Heritage Conservation Act. And it's definitely still worth exploring. And I think as Xander was going to point out, though, even the powers that those bylaws tend to be limited as well. It's worth noting. Sackville, for example, their most iconic church structure, they had a Heritage Conservation Bylaw, and the most iconic church building was up for demolition. It was protected by the bylaw, but it just meant that they had to delay for 6 months, try to sell it or find an alternative use, etc. But in the end, they lost that structure. So it's not a sure thing, and that is a different thing than what we're talking about today. But there's some inherent challenges with using that approach as well too. So
thank you.
Council, any other comments?
Your Worship,
Yes, certainly. Councilor Gumshaw?
I'd asked before about lighting, particularly in the downtown business district, the historic business district. Lighting, I didn't see anything in there about different kinds of lights, seasons when lights should be up, seasons when lights should be down, those sorts of things. Types of lighting.
They talk about signage, lighting, and the zoning bylaws. So that might be a way to encompass some additional concerns, because talks about exterior and internal lighting. So we might be able to maybe answer some of those concerns as part of that. I'm not sure, Your Worship, of the planners, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think it certainly is focused in the zoning bylaw, but whether or not, I guess the question is, do we have, if we're going to go forward with a secondary municipal plan that deals with at least some heritage or some aspects of the downtown, should that be in there or not, sort of thing? What do you think, Mr. Gupen? What's the thinking around that?
So I think what I thought the last time this came up, and I think I still think the same thing, is if we're talking about lighting design, so like fixture design, that would make sense to be regulated in this document. So, you know, just for example, they have to be wrought iron. I don't think that level of design detail is necessary. And if we're talking about the actual lighting itself, and, you know, it should be downward facing, it shouldn't be on between the hours of 9 at night and or what, you know, hours or that kind of thing, that's better regulated in the zoning bylaw, because that wouldn't apply to a specific area of town. That would, I think, be the whole town where that would be an issue. But if council feels like the design of lighting fixtures should be regulated within a specific area, and that happens to be the historic business district or town plat, then this is the document to do that in.
Your Worship, if I may.
Yes, Councilor Wishart.
I think the town has a significant investment in the style of lighting downtown. It's part of the signature of the streetscape in the evening in St. Andrews. So I think we should have at least a section or a mention in the secondary plan about the lighting downtown. Thank you.
Council, thank you, Councilor Gummichel. Council, what do you think? Should we send our planners back to draft something for us to look at?
I don't mean to slow things down. It's not the first time.
No,
this
not
has
at
come-
all.
Question? Is it
Certainly.
seasonal lighting, or are you talking about signage lighting? Because we have the signage bylaw, which restricts certain lighting that's done in the windows of the shopkeepers already. Are you talking about seasonal decoration lighting? Councillor Gummichel?
Through your Worship, yes,
Yep.
Councillor Akaji, it's come up in the past with at different times, different businesses and different residences string up lights, and there doesn't seem to be any regulation to it. I'm not saying they're nice lights or bad lights. I think that that we should have something in there stipulating when is appropriate and what's appropriate. That's all. And this has come up a number of times before you came back on to Councillor Akaji. So it's beating a dead horse here.
Just for Councillor Akaji, I think what Councillor Gummichel has talked about in the past is the single bulb lighting that you see on strings. They're large bulbs, and what they do is they light up basically you can see it quite a ways away. It really is extra lighting than what you're accustomed to in kind of a heritage downtown district of St. Andrews. And I think that's his concern. I hate to say it, but it's Costco string lighting is what it is. I've seen the exact ones there.
Just a response from me. It seems to me that if we are, and we still haven't decided that as a council, but we're moving towards, with this draft, we're moving towards saying to people, we prefer cedar shakes, clapboard, or reasonable facsimile, more modern things that simulate that. If we're going to say that about the side of your building, should we not be saying that you should be putting outside lighting on your building that mirrors the very expensive and very beautiful light standards that we put up and down the historic business district? I think that's what Councillor Gummichel is getting at.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. That seems to cover it.
And then the other stuff, as Deputy Mayor said, the other stuff can be dealt with when we get into the zoning bylaw, where we'll, I'm sure, be spending an extensive amount of time talking about lighting and the extraneous lighting that we've all had difficulties with at times.
Your worship, if I may, just for
Yes, certainly.
clarification. So you'd like the planners to look at lighting style and how that could play into the secondary municipal plan document?
Yes,
Okay.
if that's possible.
One thing, and I think this is the note which Xander touched on, is regulating style can be difficult, and but we will come back with a recommendation that I think will meet the goals that's been outlined by this discussion.
Yeah, I certainly had it in my mind that this was more part of the educational aspect of the secondary municipal plan, educating people on what's most appropriate for their stores in the downtown. Whether we make them do it or not is another question.
Okay.
Your Worship, if I may, just briefly.
Yes, certainly.
And part of this discussion too with Councillor Goumichel, I think there's concerns about display lighting, so to speak. So there might be two separate issues, because I think the secondary plans talking specifically on outside appearance and things. But then if you get people kind of decorating the inside of their windows with types of lighting and stuff, that becomes a second question. And I don't think it's addressed by this. So we don't have to decide it today, but I think as staff, we're going to have to look, because there's kind of examples of both in the downtown in the past, and try to see what council's big concern is and how we address it, because maybe it'll have to be addressed also in the signage bylaw to prevent it from overlapping with, or to going against the intent of the spirit of the secondary plan, but it doesn't get covered because it's on the inside of the actual building.
So you can't legislate good taste, but you also can't outlaw tackiness is basically what we're saying.
Your Worship, I think something like would be sort of akin to something like landscaping, where we can state, the expectations, the best practices and proposals, and sort of outline what is required, and we can, just follow the same pattern that as throughout the document. And I think that's quite reasonable, and we can flush something out that looks really good.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Brew. I agree. I think that's it is an educational process after all. Okay, wow, we're doing well on those two. For now, we hit the zoning bylaw.
Yep. Here we go, into the zoning bylaw. So this is I believe this is the first time I'm presenting specifically on the zoning bylaw, and I don't think council has really had a chance to give any input into this document yet, except where it comes through other documents. So this is the document that's least furthest along. Council initially wasn't going to look at it until elections were delayed. And in this presentation, to save time, this is a 120-page document. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I'm going to go through the major changes, and I think that is the majority of changes. We've definitely tried to clean it up and fix typos here and there, and make sure language is consistent. But I don't think that's obviously. I hope you've all had a chance to read it and make notes, and if there are things like that or other things that stand out to you that should be changed, that's definitely what we're here to talk about. But I'm going to focus on major changes, things that could be controversial, and we're going to start with short-term rentals. So their growth has been increasing. This just shows since 2016, leading up to fall of 2019, the amount of growth, and really over last year did significantly jump. It's odd. I realize now to look at a graph that isn't about cases of some disease, but I know some people see short-term rentals that way, and this has been going up and up and up. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens this summer. Hopefully lots of people are planning staycations to St. Andrews, but it's hard to imagine that will be at quite the same level that you would have with international and interprovincial tourism. So this market might be seriously impacted. We've included a new definition for short-term rental, and it means a dwelling unit or portion thereof used as an accommodation for travelers for no more than 30 days at a time. There's a few other definitions in the zoning bylaw that kind of overlap with this and are maybe ambiguous, like tourist home and tourist apartment. So for clarity, they should be removed. You should have one definition for short-term rentals. There are new zones. So service residential tourism and estate residential tourism. And they have the same lot standards as the parent zones, but they allow secondary short-term rental uses. That would be a main use in the tourist commercial, and we're treating bed and breakfasts as the same. They're in the same category, although obviously bed and breakfasts have been established business in town for many years now. So for that reason, existing bed and breakfasts that are in conformity with the current bylaw would be pre-zoned into either the service SRT or ERT, depending on where they are. And any new short-term rental use in either of those zones, I only have service residential here, but service residential or estate residential would require a rezoning into one of those or tourist commercial. And that allows council the opportunity to make development agreements, which would have terms and conditions. For example, an owner agent must meet guests. They have to be owner occupied properties. There might be some list of community standards that have to be communicated. Can't have one night stays because those tend to be more, people are more transient. They want to learn less about the community, want less to play by the community's rules. So the development agreement allows council a lot of opportunity to, on a case-by-case basis or possibly through a multi-property rezoning, set standards for this type of use. Still on the residential theme, but one thing that we've heard really loudly and clearly throughout this whole process and have talked about in the municipal plan, talk about outside of this particular planning process, is that there need to be more residential options in town. So we have another new definition for accessory dwelling unit, and that includes garden suite and in-law suite, as well as basement apartments. These have all been separately defined in the current zoning bylaw, but we don't see that as being necessary, and it's confusing, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So they're all accessory dwelling units. Some of them are inside, some of them are outside, but if you're going to regulate things outside, they should be regulated as things outside, not necessarily as a residential thing outside. So an accessory dwelling unit would, as we've drafted, is a permitted secondary use in all residential zones. But you're still limiting them by the number of buildings on a lot. So there are general provisions about how many buildings you can have on a lot, how many accessory buildings. So you can't just have 13 of these in your backyard. They're still going to be limited, and some yards might have already used up their quota of buildings on sheds or garages or other things. So I think if there are concerns that you would see these popping up everywhere, there are other mechanisms that deal with that. Another way to increase residential options are by allowing houses with more dwelling units in them. So trip currently duplexes are allowed, but that could go up to triplexes in the service residential and MR1 zones, and duplexes in the estate residential. Without proper services, you run into problems with more density. So you kind of need services to get up to that triplex level. It could go further than triplex. You could do quadplex, but having some balance, not moving too quickly, is also important. And secondary plan is really important here, because I think a valid concern about having these new residential options is they could change the character of town. But if you have a document that regulates design and character, that document, if it's doing its job right, will make sure that new residential options don't affect the town character. We're also proposing a residential growth area. I've talked about this before. It's south of the Bar Road, town-owned property, and is an opportunity probably for multi-unit expansion. Now this, I'm gonna blow through this because I wasn't totally sure we'd get here, but we did. We talked about this in the municipal plan, the setback from the ordinary high water mark. You can see that there is erosion along the coastline. So we literally talked about this. We went over the draft zoning language. I don't think there's much need to go back over it again, because this is that same limited to buffer 30-meter general prohibition. The always controversial chickens. So other municipalities in New Brunswick do allow for chickens, and they haven't run into problems yet. So this would allow for the keeping of chickens in the SR and ER zones, but only for personal use. Only female chickens, otherwise known as hens, because the roosters are the noisy ones. You're only allowed to have 4. They must be fenced during the day and cooped at night. And the coop must be in the rear yard, 10 meters from rear and side lot lines. So that for the very small lots in the town plat, it basically makes it impossible. And you would need a certain amount of land to be able to do this, and that's to ensure that these don't become a nuisance. But if they do, if there's odor and mess, that would trigger an enforcement, and they would have to be cleaned up. Or if the property owner wasn't complying, then they wouldn't be able to have them. So again, I think we have talked about this before through some of the municipal plan conversations. The sea level rise overlay zone, that's strongly regulating development below 4.4 meters. That's different from the setback from the ordinary high water mark. That's really dealing with current environmental conditions, with erosion, as well as some aesthetic concerns. This is dealing with the future. Where is the water going to be in 50 years, in 100 years? Given that buildings can last for up to 300 years, it makes sense to regulate this in a way now that you're not going to have problems in 50 to 100 years. And it's actually a fairly minimal impact, as you can see on the map. There's a little bit on Patrick Street, a little bit coming into Indian Point. But really, for the most part, it's not a major impact on properties in town. And just some other changes. None of them are large enough to get their own slide. We've distinguished between public and private utility uses. Currently, utility uses are allowed in any zone, but there's, you can have private utility uses. You can put up a radio tower, that's utility use. There's some private energy uses. You could have like a mini wind turbine, that kind of thing. And what we've heard through our discussions is those should be regulated in a way that public utility uses are not. So, if MB Power is doing something, that's a public good, that's a public use. That should have less regulation than if someone wants to put up a radio antenna in their backyard. We're introducing standards for bicycle parking. They're pretty basic and straightforward. If for every 20 car spaces, you need 1 bike space, you have to have at least 2. But it doesn't make sense for every house to have this. The historic business district, the sidewalk is already fairly used. There are posts. There are opportunities to have maybe you could have a larger rack at the town office or at either end of town, so you wouldn't have to have individual properties with their own spaces in the historic business district. But for maybe the institutional uses like the arena, Huntsman, as new properties are developed, making sure that people can bike there and leave their bikes safely is important as people shift to that mode of transportation more. Mixed use standards had aligned with the zone. So mixed use is kind of, you pick a zone and then you follow those standards. Given that all the mixed use properties are on Water Street extending out from the central commercial district in either historic business district or the town plat, we feel like it makes more sense just to have those serviced residential in the town plat standards, which are really dealing with design, whereas the mixed use zone, I think, is really, you can mix uses, but if you're having an institutional use on Water Street, you should still have the same lot standards as the other properties on Water Street. Section 9, which deals with the deals with historic business district and town plat. We've talked about that with the secondary plan, why those should be moved out. There's a few that have gone into other parts of the zoning bylaw, parking and lot standards, but for the most part, those are dealt with in the secondary plan. Flag signs, these are not currently allowed, but so many are grandfathered in that it seems like most businesses do have them, and new businesses feel like it's quite unfair to not be allowed to have them when it seems like just about everybody else has them because of that grandfathering. So it doesn't become a new sign, but you can pick between your flag, your projecting, or your freestanding. So if you're gonna have a sign that's kind of coming off of your building, one of those can be a flag, but again, that's a section of the zoning law that doesn't work super well because so many of those flags are grandfathered. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to not let people, new businesses, have flag signs, but still they should be limited. We're also introducing an institutional growth area on the Huntsman lands, those more or less undeveloped properties closer to Bayview Drive. And we've talked with them a few times about this. I know there was some concern over council that they understand what this means, that they are included in the process and that they're okay with it. So we've talked with them and they see this as a way really to get support from the town in developing these properties. So they're actually very much in favor of them being included, and they have some interesting plans. We've talked with them a little bit about possibly some new residential developments, so aligning with that more institutional scientific purpose, but also the potential of a knowledge park. That's something we refer to in the municipal plan. Some new commercial scientific businesses could be developed there. This is what we currently have for the zoning map. Probably there might need to be a few more changes. It actually hasn't changed a whole lot. You've got the residential growth area up here, the institutional growth area over here. The green space around the coast has been removed, but you've got the 30-meter setback. And there's a few existing bed and breakfast properties, I think there's one there, that have been pre-zoned as service residential tourism. So the timeline for this, you could do first reading on June 1st, with second reading July 6th, views of PRAC are requested, date for public hearing set, and July 27th, the public hearing, August 4th, third reading. And that's it for the presentation, so we can move into discussion and questions now.
Thank you, Mr. Gupin. Council, questions or reactions?
Worship?
Yes, Councilor Groot.
Okay, couple of things. Number one, under title and scope, it's fairly important when you talk about variances. At the forefront of any variances, it talks about the intent of the bylaws. And I think that if we had a statement there in section 1 saying the intent of the zoning bylaw is to set a consistent approach for development in the town of St. Andrews, and that variances should only be granted in exceptional circumstances. And then we sort of can say the onus is on the applicant for the variance to demonstrate why the bylaw cannot be followed and why a variance is necessary. And that would set the tone, I think, for variances, and would be very clear that we expect people to follow the bylaw. And I think that's needed because, again, everything on variances reflects the intent of the bylaw. And I think that would clarify things. The other thing, I'm really relieved to find that the number of definitions of dwelling, I counted 16 of them. And it's complicated because each of these definitions has its own little nuance. And it's hard to follow. It really is. And I think that if we can simplify that, that would be really, really great. The other thing is when we look at the definitions, we have definitions there that are not even mentioned in the document. Like, I'll use the example as, I don't think we use the word abattoir anywhere in the zoning bylaw, but it's the first definition.
My personal favorite.
The other point, and I think you covered this, Xander, is that the mixed use zone, I think, is far too liberal. Like it allows institutional use, which I don't think we're ever going to allow an institutional use to be on Water Street. That would be a pretty far-fetched one. Multiple residential zone, MR1, I don't know if we'd have that on Water Street in a mixed use as well. It's kind of a, so we may want to pare down the number of uses there. The other one is, I'm not sure, and this one I'd probably have to be educated on it, is when you're looking at changing a use in the mixed use zone. Right now, it's the Planning Advisory Committee that makes that decision. I don't know if it should go to council, depending on what the use would be, because you could have a pretty dramatic change in use for, when you start talking about going in the mixed use zone. So I don't know if council would like to have the opportunity to weigh in on that or not. So I think that's, in a nutshell, that's an overview. But otherwise, I think we're in the right direction. The last thing I'd just like to say is I've been getting an awful lot of negative feedback on chickens. Everybody I've talked to says, "Are you guys nuts or what?" and the expression I've heard the most is, "Chickens will become the new deer." I'll leave it at that.
I've got a question and follow up to that, Councillor Groh. I've got a question for, could be for Mr. Goupan or probably for Mr. Henderson, the director. Are we going to get, I understand what you're saying, Councillor Groh, in terms of talking about whose onus there is at a planning advisory committee and in terms of the granting of variances. Are we going to get at cross purposes with the Community Planning Act if we moved in that direction?
Your Worship, the question, actually, I ran this also by legal regarding the language you could use around setting the framework for variances. So that's already in the Community Planning Act, and you can't do anything different than what the Community Planning Act states when it comes to variances. So in other words, you can't fetter the Community Planning Act. However, I think what might be, and what I think Councillor Groux might be saying is you need to really articulate the intent of the bylaw. So and this is actually very helpful to planners and development officers when they're looking at a potential variance. And had one today where I knew what the intent of the bylaw was in this particular instance, and I've recommended to a resident against a variance on that basis. So I said, you know, if this goes to committee, I'll recommend against it. And typically that they don't really proceed with their original plans if we say that to them. But it's useful for us to know the intent of the bylaw. So if the intent of the bylaw, I think what Councillor Groux said at first was, you know, set a consistent approach to development through the community where variances exist. They have to comply with the Community Planning Act. I think that would be appropriate. You just can't say you can't give a variance or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think where I have I get a bit of a knot in my stomach is when someone comes to town and they do a new construction and the first thing they do is submit a variance. And you sort of say, geez, we have a bylaw here. You can't comply with the bylaw and you need a variance right off the top. Surely you can alter your design so that it fits with the bylaw rather than trying to get a variance right from the get-go. That's where it becomes problematic. I think there has to be an onus on the part of the public to comply with the bylaw and demonstrate to the town and to the development officer why you can't comply with the bylaw and what the circumstance is that you won't be able to comply. But you have to make an effort to comply. That's I think at the heart of it.
It is an interesting discussion, and I think what you have with variances are situations where by wherever configuration of the property or the situation, a variance from the requirement is reasonable, it's desirable for the development land, and meets within the general intent of the bylaw. And I think this is a very interesting discussion. But what I wouldn't do is say, you know, you have to do X before a variance can be granted if that's not one of the things requirements of the Community Planning Act. But I think articulating the purpose of the bylaw or the sections of the bylaw is totally appropriate. In fact, in the provisions for the sea level rise zone, one of the things included in there, and I could be mistaken, we might have taken it out, but I've seen examples of this where they've included the purposes of the sea level rise zone. So variances aren't granted to negate the purpose of the zone. You know what I mean? So if the setback was X and varied down to 0, well, if you're going against a clearly stated purpose of that zone, that's a, you know, so some instances you might want to have the purpose of this provision is, and that actually is very useful and gives guidance to committees.
Just to comment on that, the one that's always boggled my mind was the fact that we got into the habit of varying prohibitions. You know, the bylaw says you cannot do this, but then a planning committee varies something that you can't do in the first place. I get it. You know, your garden shed is okay to be 5 feet or 2 feet closer to somebody's property than what's provided because you don't have enough room to build one otherwise. So a good reason for it. But if council says you can't build your garage in front of your house in a particular neighborhood, you know, it's still technically possible for a planning advisory committee to vary that with a variance, as I understand it. Is that those are the ones I have trouble with?
It is hard to make absolute statements on this. So one of the things which and it's kind of a new tool which proposed for St. Andrews design manual and the secondary municipal plan, the requirements in that cannot be varied. So that goes straight to council. And I think it also goes to the other point Councillor Groux raised is, can there be some of the mixed use zones, not to jump ahead too much, but can there be some of the mixed use zone changes go to council? Again, this is one of these things where you have certain things that are handled by council and certain things that are handled by the planning committee in legislation. And uses that are subject to terms and conditions go to planning committees. Rezonings go to council. But with this secondary municipal plan, that's just in council's purview. So there may be things which I think you might need to think about elevating it to the secondary municipal plan, such as Councillor Gumichel said with lighting. There may be issues which are of importance that that council does not want to see varied and really wants to stress, drive home that these things need to be upheld and period. There's no variation from it. And you have to tread carefully there because you don't want to stifle a good development from happening just because the situation is a little different. And that variances exist because it's really hard to give an absolute rule that applies perfectly in all situations with the most, you can't develop a bylaw that good, but just what we've done with the secondary municipal plan, it's really well researched. We've really tested it. I'm not saying it's a perfect document, but it doesn't overshoot the impossibility of enforceability and making sense in 99% of situations.
Your worship, just on variances under 2.35, it says the planning advisory may give notice to owners of land in the immediate neighborhood. I'd like to see that if we're giving a variance or considering a variance in a neighborhood, that the neighbor's aware, because something that might be minor to one person might be, and may means you may or may not. Shall means that we are going to notify people that their neighbor is requesting something outside of our regular bylaws. I think they have a right to know. And to be honest, I think council should have a right to know if a variance request is coming in. So I don't know if that's something that council is pertain to changing, but I think that we have an obligation to the residents of this town to let them know about all the variances that impact them directly.
I concur with that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
And then under, if I keep going, since under 2.7 about the $1,000 fee for rezoning. I understand why that's there. There's a lot that needs to be done, including redoing the map. But I was wondering if somebody is looking to rezone to almost fit our municipal plan, have it be turning a short-term rental into a long-term rental, which is a concern. If there's anything that's required, if there's any ability for council to consider waiving that, you know what I mean? I understand sometimes there's fees, but sometimes people might do something that helps the overall community, but they're reluctant to do it because of the $1,000 fee, especially the fact that if they're unsuccessful, I don't think they get their money back. It makes some people hesitant. 2.9 is interpretation. I don't know if it's required, but if you guys look at 2.9, the A to H, it talks about masculine versus feminine, talks about past, present. Maybe it's required for the legality behind it, but before you even get into it, you've read like 9 different things that get people's heads spinning. I don't know if there's a way to make that easier or if it's required, but there's if you're talking about the past tense, it refers to the present and the future. If you're talking about the present tense, it may include the past. If someone's reading that, it is a lot. I understand it's probably there for legal issues. It's just, there's a lot of that. Is the line of vision at intersections, is that the same as our previous bylaw? Just to confirm. That's word for word. Okay, just making sure on that one, because I know that before we were on council, it was quite an issue in the community. Is it possible under the zoning bylaw to put something in regards to if chickens get loose, that there's a fine or something like that? Just because I know that that's something that you see is chickens running around town. I think, Councillor Grew's comments well taken, but I almost think you have a hearing of objections for a reason. Let's hear the public say if they want chickens or not. But I think that there should be some type of course of action if people, if you see chickens running around, we can't have that happening, obviously, right? It'd be pretty problematic.
We have that problem with dogs right now, and we still don't have a control over it.
Under minimum parking requirements, I know it talks about how many is needed for restaurants. If you had like a shop that turned into a restaurant, does that make it now required, or is it grandfathered in because of the building? Is that only new buildings? I'll give you an example. Mermaid Tails used to be retail, now it's a restaurant. So do they need to qualify for the parking requirements when we get into that in the zoning bylaw? Might be on mute there.
It should be when there's a change of use, the new parking requirements for that new use are required, I believe.
Your worship, if I may,
Yes,
in the cases of a parking requirement in the Heritage Business District, they are exempt from parking. And this has been something that's carries over from the existing bylaws. So commercial uses are exempt, but residential uses, hotel uses, other types of tourist accommodation uses in Heritage Business District are not exempt from parking requirements. So if you do have a change of use, it does entail a look at current standards. So in most cases, I think Councillor Henderson would be correct. You would switch from retail to restaurant. Development officer have to check to make sure the parking is adequate. But that case you wouldn't, because it's exempt clearly from parking requirements.
Your worship, if I may, not to
Councillor Gomicheau?
thank you, not to talk specifics, but since we already are, I think that the Mermaid Tales was originally designed as a restaurant and was opened instead as a retail space, and now they've gone back to a restaurant. So I should suspect that all of the terms and conditions were already met initially when they first opened. So since it was intended to be a restaurant.
Okay, good.
If I could keep going, Your Worship, just because I had a few here.
Certainly, go for it.
Under Navy Island, it said one or more of the following main uses: a seasonal dwelling. Have we always allowed development on Navy Island, or is that a big change to the municipal plan?
If I may, that is the same. Navy Island hasn't changed. I think there was a push in the last municipal plan and this process to have it as a new zone with a lot of restrictions, but we haven't changed it since the last zoning bylaw.
Okay. Moving along, under the signage bylaw, I don't know if it's just is overruled, but if you look at what we're dealing with COVID-19, if you look outside Joey's Independent Grocer, he's got a number of signs up that are very vital for public health. Are those exempt from the signing bylaw? Like the 2-meter signs, they're going to be accustomed for the next year or 2 years. If we bring this bylaw in, does that take into consideration all the regulated signs that are required, or even optional signs for the better of the public? I'm just wondering how they come into play with the new zoning bylaw.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Maybe there needs to be some kind of, temporary signs, things that are temporary usually are exempted, but Deputy Mayor Henderson's making a really good point that these might not be temporary in the sense that we think they could be here for a year, for 2 years. There will probably be other public health emergencies in the future, even if they have nothing to do with COVID. So maybe there should be some kind of exemption for that type of signage.
I concur with that. I think those, Deputy Mayor, I think those are emergency signs predicated on some action by the government that required them to be in place. They're not really the same as advertising your business, right? It's, so I don't think those count in terms of the scorecard for how many signs you can have on your business. That's the way I'd like to look at it.
Yeah, like the COVID-19 operational plan requires quite a few new signs and things like that. And even the ones the government have aren't the most visually appealing. So maybe a business might make their own. That's
Sure.
I think we're going to have to be pretty open-minded. So I think we should somehow capture that or something, because otherwise pretty much every business. The other one is illuminated signage. I know that it's throughout as internally illuminated signage. I think we need to really deter that from happening. It doesn't fit with the mold. The other one is it says displays lights resembling the flashing lights usually associated with danger. Those use police, fire, ambulance. I think we should have no flashing lights. It goes to Councillor Gumachel's point. I don't think we need flashing lights in the town of St. Andrews for any business. Or maybe they may not see it, but I think you don't even have to put the other part is no flashing lights and none of those attention lights. The other one is it says that under 7.6 prohibited sign, no sign shall be erected, operated, or maintained is a mural. So does that mean that the mural on the side of the hardware store would no longer be allowed to be maintained? Or on the drugstore, or maybe even the water tower? I don't know. Like, are those all things that, because I know that when travel writers come here, and tourists, they fall in love with those murals. They make our town better, not take away. So I was wondering if they're considered as part of that.
If I may, and this might also address the emergency sign issue. And I remember thinking about this, particularly the murals, because I thought exactly that same thing. They're a really wonderful part of town, although art is subjective, so not everybody agrees on what is wonderful about murals. But the definition for sign, it's any structure, device, light, painting, or other representation or natural object that is used to identify, advertise, or attract attention to any object, place, activity, person, institution, organization, firm, group, commodity, etc., or which displays any representation, different kinds of things used to represent announcement, direction, or advertisement. And I think if, like the mural on the hardware store, it's a scene of St. Andrews. It's not a mural for the hardware store. It's not saying buy hardware here. So I don't know if that falls, the way we've looked at this before is that doesn't actually fall under the definition of what a sign is.
Public art.
Just because you could see kind of I guess you could say when you read it, I think it's kind of a gray area that might be confusing for some. I don't know if there's a way that we can clarify that a little more. I totally understand you don't want, buy this here in a painting of it on the side of a building, right? Like I completely understand, but the way it reads right now is that mural probably is not allowed to be maintained. Like based on the zoning bylaw, the way it reads. Maybe I'm reading it wrong, but that just outright bans it on the side of a business.
If I may, the regulation of signs in the Community Planning Act is about advertising. So if they're not, like as Andrew's saying, if it's not advertising, it's art, and the zoning bylaw doesn't regulate art. But if it was a big thing, it says Coca-Cola or get your hot dogs here, and it's a mural, that's prohibited.
Yeah, I just wondering if there was a whale watching boat it's a scene of the wharf, I believe. If there was a whale watching boat on the front of it, is that advertising? I know the one on the side of the hardware store has a business on it. I'm just wondering if it crosses over. But again, if you think that that's art, I agree it is art. I think it makes the town better. Same as any of those. Like I'd hate to see those go away, I guess is my point. And then you just have kind of the white sides. The width of the sign for signs, it says 90% of the building or width of the building. Was that just taken from the previous bylaw as well?
Yeah.
Okay. So Joey's in theory could have the width of the building and that long in theory. I know there's a height, but like where does that? You know what I mean? Like that's a pretty big sign.
It's regulated in height, so 24 inches is the max. So what you have sometimes is if you think about it like a fascia board.
Yep.
And you have that area between the first story and then the second story. There's usually a fascia board on traditional buildings, and yeah, you can do 90%. And you have to think about there's certain buildings that are they only have 20 feet width. So when you're trying to have use that to your advantage as a business, you want to use that as much as you can. So that rule tends to work, but signs are one of these areas where it can be very difficult to get the prescriptions for them just right, because you've got buildings that don't have a traditional fascia board. So there's actually a request for a variance for one at this coming PRAC meeting. So just kind of an interesting case of that.
Okay. is there a way to define street banners in the definitions? Just because it's not in the definitions, and street banners to the general public can mean a lot of different things. To me, it means the banner that you come across right before the arena when you come into the town. And it kind of says that they can be pre-approved, but maybe that's what it's referring to, but it just says, it's not in the definition, so I'm not 100% sure, like legally, if I was reading it, what that means. And then I think that's it. The only other thing I'll say, I've said it before with everything else, is to really, and I'm sure you have, but to go through that zoning map with a very magnifying glass and compare the two, because when they did the last municipal plan, even this council inherited a number of mistakes that was made during that process. And I really think that if we're rezoning someone's land as part of this process, they have a right to know. They need to know that. And there, I don't know how many there was, but there maybe your worship, but there were several times that the council had to deal with mistakes in the zoning map.
Yeah, it's a big credibility problem for council if we don't even know that the map is correct.
But all in all, a great job. I know I went through it, but we haven't had a chance to discuss it. So there's just some notes I made there on the side of it that I wanted to discuss today.
Just a quick comment to Deputy Mayor Henderson's thing about the fascia sign. Would it be possible, probable, or advisable for those very large buildings to set a maximum length of a fascia sign? In other words, it's okay to have 90% of a 20-foot width, but if you've got a 40-foot width, are you going to allow a 36-foot sign? That's sort of what you're getting at. Hey, that's
correct. We've got some very long buildings in this community that you could get quite a few words on if you wanted to.
Yeah.
We can definitely bring back. I'm taking notes here, so we'll bring back some revisions here. So definitely we'll look at that.
Your worship, I have another couple of comments that
certainly, Councillor
committed. Para 3.7, which is uses prohibited in all zones. We had run into a problem previously where there was a dilapidated mobile home that was not being used as a residence or a business premises. It was being used as storage. And we actually had to pay to move it. So I think that the language there can be altered so that it's any mobile home used within the town of St. Andrews is prohibited. So I think we need to broaden that definition so that it's not just a residence or a business. It could be storage, it could be anything. The other thing that the other point I just wanted to make was, I know in the definitions when you look at dwellings and when you've got a new definition for accessory dwelling, you've modified that considerably. Perhaps when you're talking about a rental suite or a garden suite, it might be useful if we make it very clear that those are long-term rentals, not designed for short-term rentals. I know that was an issue with some of the definitions of dwellings. It was sort of implied, but it wasn't clearly stated that they were long-term rentals. Like, I think converted dwelling is a good example. That's a long-term rental, but it's an implied, thing. It should be, I think, stated, explicitly that it's long-term rentals. And that's about it. Thank you very much. I echo the sentiments from the Deputy Mayor. It's a good first cut.
Any other questions, Council?
Your worship, with regard to, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, I can. Yep.
Thank you, Your worship. With regard to flags, perhaps with so many grandfathered in and it not being fair for new businesses with flags, perhaps we just get rid of open flags altogether, unless it's a Canada flag or a New Brunswick flag or perhaps an Acadian flag. It shouldn't be flying, and that would fix it. So just get rid of flags. And also, just a side note for the fellas there, when the council started, we had a PAC, and we had our own planner. And over the term of this council, we've gone from doing our own planning to the regional model. And I have to admit, I was a bit nervous about it at first, but the fellas have done a great job. They've tackled a lot of the problems we had and really turned things around. And so congratulations and thank you to the fellas.
Thank you, Councillor Goodmichelle.
Your Worship, if I may. I appreciate the comments there from Councillor Goodmichelle. Thanks for that. Regarding the point on signs, so one of the things that was part of the process that began 2 years ago with this the study that went into this, so we did fairly extensive consultation with the business community in St. Andrews, and something we heard fairly consistently was a concern about the lack of flexibility around signs and flag signs. They were looked at pretty extensively by a steering committee and planning. So what we proposed was it's actually a fairly, in my opinion, fairly modest kind of introduction of flexibility to allow signs. Because right now, what you said, Councillor Goodmichelle, is actually what's in effect with the current bylaw. You can do a Canadian flag or New Brunswick flag. You can't do any other type of flag. So what we were trying to do is say, where is the place? Is there a place for these business signs? And if it's clearly stated that an open sign or a coffee or ice cream on a flag is an actual advertisement that's regulated by zoning, you make a place for it. And if you already have your projecting sign or a fascia sign, you can't do that flag sign. So I think one of the things is actually bringing clarity, but also giving a little bit of flexibility where some properties are situated in such a way they can't do those freestanding signs, or even a projecting sign doesn't really make sense, but a flag sign does. So there is a bit of a challenge with signs, and I know this is one of these issues that is a perennial issue for council. But I just wanted to offer that other perspective as well for consideration. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, Your Worship.
And signs. Sorry.
Of course, the issue comes up. You end up with hot dog flags and all sorts of different flags. So I think if many businesses have flags grandfathered in, just simply removing flags altogether and going back to either a sign or something hanging out or flat and no flags, and that would certainly fix the problem.
Your Worship, just maybe one last point I forgot to say.
Certainly.
With grandfathering and legal nonconforming, what's called under the Community Planning Act is you can't use a present bylaw to set standards for something that pre-existing the bylaw standard itself. So you can't set the standard for flag signs and say to someone who's had a flag sign in use consistently for 20 years that you need to now conform with today's standards. So that's the to enforce the bylaw to prove that they have a permit, signed permit, legal. And that's where there's an enforcement part of this. So I just wanted to point that out as well, that very tricky, and you have to make sure you're following the act.
Well, Alex is cutting out there. We've actually gone back. There was a concern, I think, that one business in St. Andrews had taken signs down and then put them back up again. And there was a big question, were these grandfathered, were they not? And we went back through all the records. We did that work. So, and in the end, I think they had been. Once you can't really put the genie back in the bottle, I think is the short way to say it.
It is. Xander, I just have a comment. It is an interesting point. However, when we take a look at the secondary municipal plan, we're going to great pains to educate and maybe even regulate what the front of your building looks like, but not about what your sign looks like. But we've already got standards and signs that said, yes, you know, the overhanging signs and the ones they're supposed to look like wood, and they do, and the ones that we really approve of, but we've allowed the proliferation of all these flags that don't fit the historical context of the downtown of our historic business district. So I don't know, maybe we should be up for a fight about flags and say, flags are passe, they're no longer. I'll tell you one of the arguments that you'll get mostly from businesses, because I've gotten them myself, is that a hand-painted sign costs a lot of money and the flag costs next to nothing, right? That's the, you know, it's an economic thing, just like that was much of the argument about the Heritage Conservation Act dilemma, is that the prevailing thought was it's going to cost a whole lot more if you have that than if you don't have it. So whether that's true or not, I don't know. Anyway, interesting. That obviously that'll be something we can expect to hear about at the hearing of objections, potentially.
If I may, I just want to address one other question that came up that's easy to address. The reason to define things that aren't in the zoning bylaw is to ensure that they don't enter in through a lack of being defined. So with an abattoir, if it's clearly defined, it's very hard to say, oh, but this thing that where I'm, you know, slaughtering animals and processing, actually it's not an abattoir, it's a restaurant or a kitchen. If you define it clearly, then you can say, no, you're doing these things, this is defined as an abattoir, you can't do it. And I think, you know, adult use establishment is in there too. So you also, you define things that you want, but you also define things you don't want.
Okay, good.
On that note, just about the hearing of objections, is there any way that we can separate kind of signage versus the regular? I'll give you an example. Last hearing of objections we had, obviously that 30-meter coastal, I guess, a conservation area, it dominated the time people had for a hearing of objections. So some people might have had some concerns, but maybe because of the heat of it or the issues, they didn't come forward with other areas of the municipal plan. I'm wondering if separating out the signage versus, you know, all the other, I don't know if there's any value in doing it that way, so people can talk about that issue and it doesn't get dominated by, you know, zoning or something like that, and it doesn't get addressed. Because I feel like there's some people that had other concerns on the municipal plan and just didn't raise them because of the heat and everything that happened on the other issue.
If I may,
Certainly.
one thought is, I mean, the Community Planning Act says there has to be a public hearing. It doesn't really go further than that. Council can have as many public sessions as they want. And with the signage, I would assume that mostly is going to affect business owners. And that I mean, people might care about the aesthetics as well. But it might make sense to have, you know, one official public hearing, but also maybe more just a public feedback session before we go to the public hearing, because at that point you're pretty locked in, specifically on signage. That's an option.
Yeah, even if we met with, had a meeting with between the planners and town staff and maybe, I don't know, counselors, maybe not counselors, but the chamber and the BIA to get their feedback on, from a business perspective, on maybe we're missing the mark on flag signs, maybe we are, I don't know, but get their feedback on what they think that they need to be successful at business in our community.
Yeah, that sounds like something that might be worth doing. Good. Is that it for Ken? Well, again, thank you very much, Mr. Gupin and Mr. Henderson, for being here and taking our questions. So this is just the beginning or the ongoing saga of the process. So we'll get going. Before we move on, we did agree that we were going to go back to Mr. Spear and have a quick conversation about staff's recommendations on reopening of the town. So maybe we can do that now. Mr. Spear?
Sure. Thank you, Your Worship. I'd like to circle back quickly, though, regards to the presentation. So Mr. Gopin had proposed that we go to first reading at the coming meeting in June for the zoning bylaw. Does council want to do that, or do you want to get together and kind of amend the initial draft that goes to first reading prior to doing that? I guess both are acceptable, and I don't know if Alex is still here. Yeah, Alex is still here, but I don't know if one is preferable over the other or not. So Alex, do you think if council has a lot of concerns still or want to address it, do you think it's better to do it prior to first reading or after first reading?
Well, what I might suggest is you do a first reading with all the changes you want in it. So, for example, when you make your motion to introduce first reading, you make it with the following changes included, and that gives clear direction to planning staff. We had this conversation, I've taken notes, but what we'll come back to you versus what you can tell us clearly with a first reading with the following amendments made, that would be helpful. Now we're gonna try our best to give guidance and keep the conversation going and not just rely on a clear and strictly outlined motion. But I think it's a good idea to do your first reading with amendments for the draft. I wouldn't do request to view of the PRAC right away. Sorry, how would I say this? You can do the first reading with the changes, and then do your second reading, and still make further changes, and then set the date for PRAC, set the date for the public hearing, because then you're locking it in stone, right? So you give a couple kicks of the can with council to do the fine tuning at second reading. First reading is the major overhauls. Does that make sense, that process where you're?
Yeah, that makes sense to me, Mr. Henderson. It seems to me that June 1st might be too soon for first reading if you are to go back and provide us with some what suggestions we've made today for amendments. That we need to probably look at those again once you bring them back. And then what do you think, Mr. Spear? It seems at council, it seems that June 1st might be a little bit too quick for that.
I think June 1st is quick, and I might disagree with Alec or Mr. Henderson on the best way to proceed. My only concern is there's been a lot of discussion here today and different amendments, and I'm afraid the amendment motion could take four hours if we go, piecemeal like that. I think it's more efficient to have another devoted meeting where we just take the zoning bylaw and council can talk and have informal votes about which way they'd like it to go before taking the first reading. That'd be my only concern, but I'll certainly follow whatever direction your worship and council gives on that.
Yeah, that's pretty consistent with what I intended to say anyway, that we're just not ready to vote on first reading.
So just a question, your worship, is if we go to first and second reading, then we do the public consultation, and the public comes back with all sorts of changes, then we have to go do another public consultation, right, and start the merry-go-round again. Yeah, I hear you. But I guess the first thing is, I guess from our point of view, if we can get it as right as we think it should be in the first reading, then maybe the public consultation comes right after that. I don't think we ever get it right the first time. Oh, I know. But we can always hope, eh? Yeah.
If I may, your worship, though, something we've done in the past too, though, with the other bylaws was had an informal presentation and maybe discussion prior to the formal notice of objection. Yeah. Sometimes that helps that a little bit by giving the public two kicks at the can, so to speak, that we put on the first case council can discuss before we kind of massage that to our close to final version to present to the public.
Yeah, I'm certainly good with that if the rest of council is, and I'll leave that to you and Mr. Henderson to figure out the new schedule for us.
Just back, if I can, your worship, has the Service Commission have enough information for all our bylaws to move forward? You've got the instruction?
Your worship, if I may. Yeah,
Yes.
I do agree. I think we have a good basis which to come back with a refined draft so that you guys can take our refined draft and then do your first reading. Again, if we and it's largely following the intent of the will of council as we heard it expressed today, then there might only be a few amendments you need to do at your first reading, like the process, as I said. Yeah, and it would make sense to postpone first reading, but maybe set another discussion date like this that we did today to go over our refined draft in the coming months.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank
Okay, Mr. Spear.
Sure. So, council, as you're aware, we're finally getting sunny weather. We had winter last weekend, or the weekend before last, and then this long weekend was almost summery. So we're starting to see a lot of our own citizens out and starting to see the public come forth. So the town is working hard to come up with a plan, and we're about 99% there. We're still working on finding supplies. So right now, as of today, the town hall is somewhat open to the public. We're not allowing people into the back office area, but we have a plan in place to allow at least access to the front desk and things. But the next big question, though, for council is about moving forward with like the public washrooms, Centennial Park, benches, and picnic tables. So we've been working closely with public safety, who have given us some indication of what direction they would like to go. But what it comes down to is staff are willing, as long as we get the disinfectant supplies in this week, and able to put out like benches and picnic tables throughout the community starting this week to kind of coincide with the first farmers market. And then also to get our public washrooms in the Centennial Park washrooms opening and running and getting the gate open there for the season again. Essentially, as you know, we talked about a sanitation team, so we'll have the 2 to 3 times of cleaning at all these facilities, which is all that's being required right now, as far as we can tell from the public safety and the public health offices. So we think we are there, but we know there's a concern that if we start opening up things too fast, that it'll attract a lot of people, and that social distancing will be hard to achieve in the downtown area. Over the weekend, various senior management staff were in town at various times, and on the sidewalks and trails, things were fine. About the high areas, were out by the point, but mostly people in cars and walkers, but the walkers tended to cross the roads with each other or get out of the way. And of course, down at the Blockhouse, but again, the parking lot was full, but in most cases, people would come at different times and then went out onto the beach or, explored the downtown. So my question is council okay with us? It's a week earlier than we anticipated, but trying to open up some of these facilities early to assist the business owners who are struggling with their own washrooms and trying to provide facilities? Or would you like to have a broader discussion next Monday night at the committee meeting for us to hold down expanding the facilities until we hear from you?
Thank you, Mr. Spear. Council?
Your worship?
Yep.
I think we saw this past weekend that people are coming either way, and all it's doing by not being prepared is the community's at greater risk by not having public washrooms open, not having places for them to go. By opening the park, it spreads them out even more. By having the washrooms ready, it keeps them out of our essential services like Joey's Independent Grocer. It's summertime in St. Andrews. The province has allowed businesses to reopen, and as such, we should reopen our community to support those businesses.
Your worship, well, I think staff's recommendations, I have confidence in staff to handle this appropriately. I don't think council needs to weigh in. I think we're at a point right now where social distancing is probably down to about 4 feet. I was at Keith Building Supplies this morning, and the contractors, they didn't care. They were just, give me the stuff and I don't care how close you are. It's starting, the social distancing is starting to erode a bit.
Hey, thank you, Councillor Grew. Anybody else?
I think as long as we have the sanitation supplies and the washrooms are being cleaned on regular intervals and things like that, I think we shouldn't let our guard down too much, because we don't want to put ourselves going backwards instead of forwards with this COVID-19. We've been very fortunate, but when you open it up to a whole load of people coming from all over the place, and that's no problem. I know we need that business. We're a tourist town, but we have to be cautious also. And I think that's one thing to remember. Thank you.
Councillor Bishop.
I agree, Your Worship, with the comments so far. We need to be ready. The people are coming, so the quicker we can get our sanitation team up and running and be prepared so that everyone's safe, people coming and the people who are already here.
I agree too. I hope our sanitation group is ready to go and that we maintain it to the high standards that we've asked people to do in our town.
Good. Thank you, Council. I think I absolutely agree that our senior staff have handled this very well up until now, and I have every confidence that they'll make the right judgments this week and open when they can and safely, and bring anything back to us that develops that they need to get instruction from us. So let's go ahead. And I absolutely agree. I was out and about quite a bit on the weekend, and you know, people are just excited. They're going to get out, and we should provide our full service to them as quickly as we can, and hope for the best, and actually monitor the social distancing if we see it. So we'll have to do our monitoring and enforcement as we go along, just to make sure.
I'd just like to ask one question.
Certainly.
Will the staff be required to wear masks and things when they're cleaning washrooms and stuff like that, or if they're coming in close contact with other people? Because I don't want to put staff in an awkward position or an unsafe position. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Bishop.
No, certainly for any, especially anything on the inside, specifically, they'll be providing masks. What we are doing though is we also have plans to wash benches and things twice a day. So likely they won't be wearing them when they're the outside. We'll try to enforce them or remind them that if people come up to them, they're supposed to be putting on their masks, but we'll are providing them as best we can and asking them to wear them as best they can.
Will there be portable washrooms in addition to the current washrooms that we have?
That's a good question. And so certainly we've had locations like the tennis courts and out on Indian Point where we've had portable washrooms. In town here at Town Hall, we're probably going to have them, because as part of our operation plan, we're only allowing one person in each of the men's and one person in each of the women's washroom in order to avoid social distancing. So in order to meet the demand, we're probably going to have to throw a couple here, and one of them will be accessible. For the time being, we're trying to hold off to see if the crowds warranted it. But I think just seeing this weekend how many people were here, and the fact we're losing basically 4 stalls in the downtown, we're probably going to have to go that direction immediately.
Yes, I agree. There were a lot of people around on the weekend, so thank you.
Your Worship, if I may, just a couple
Yes.
questions I got today through you, if I may.
Yes.
Are all the garbage bins out in downtown area? I've seen them on Prince or on the back street and things like that, but I had a business owner ask when we were putting those out. I assume they were out.
They're only limited right now because of the sanitation issues.
Okay.
So I know people don't tend to walk over those things or handle them too much, but we are planning on at least giving the top surfaces a cleaning to protect
Yep.
people. So after this meeting, Public Works tomorrow and Thursday will start putting all that stuff out in order to meet this weekend.
Sounds good. And then the other question I got today it was just wondering what the plan was for the skate park this summer by the youth center. That is not going to be open. Is it going to be open? If so, what's the time frame that we're anticipating on that? I got mixed views on that.
As do I. The reality is, for me, I see the skate park as a less touch-based play area, say, than a kid's playground, because they're basically on their boards or on their feet, so there's very little hand movement. But specifically, the province is restricting the use on those, and they mentioned skate parks specifically. What I've told Debbie Lord, because she made a big plea for me to open them up too, is that there's a big hope that we'll move into the next phase on this Friday's announcement from the Premier, if everything goes well, and I suspect the playgrounds will be opened up again. And so we'll add that and add that to our cleaning rotation. And so I'm hoping that by the weekend that'll be opened up.
Okay, so feedback would be that it's probably going to be with the next phase that incorporates playgrounds.
Yeah, and we've been in discussion with lots of municipalities. I mean, people said to me, well, St. John and Fredericton has theirs open, but specifically in St. John, they've got security guards sitting there to monitor that there's 10 people. We're not able to go there. Our skate park is popular, but not that popular at once. So I think as long as we're not seeing 25 or 30 kids getting there, which would be unusual, we should. The cities that have opened these places are doing it by having staff sitting there during the opening hours and monitoring the number of participants, which the town isn't able to do.
Through you, your worship, this
Yep.
did come in through EMO. So on the answers of playground skate parks, it says, although not explicitly stated in the mandatory order, playgrounds are being included in the orange phase of New Brunswick's recovery, and therefore can open at the discretion of each owner and operator, including municipalities and school districts. So it'll still be up to the municipality to decide on opening.
Okay. So, okay, sounds good.
Your worship,
Yes.
one last question. We've been talking about a number of town assets, the park and the skate park, but we haven't discussed the wharf and operational changes that we might want to consider in as a normal for COVID, and a reopening plan for the wharf as a safe place to go, and also as a tourism attraction. Hoping we can get something together for the wharf and get it open as well.
Yes, and just sorry to follow up, the wharf actually has plans to try to get that, to get that opening by this weekend. Probably the plan will be that we'll prohibit traffic except for user groups that need to come out and load up boats and things, but that we'll try to open it to pedestrian traffic almost immediately, and just to see how the flow is. Where our thoughts are that the tour boat operators cannot operate until at least July 1st. So if they're not running their groups up and down, just the natural flow of traffic should be a lot less. So as long as we have it signed for social distancing and keeping the vehicles off there so people have lots of room to move around, that we should be able to get that opened. And then for the pleasure boaters, for instance, they'll be able to get their boats in. We're planning on putting in the dinghy docks this week, but that they'll only be able to come down with their vehicles up on an appointment basis, so that we don't get a whole bunch of vehicles that push everyone together and get a lot of traffic out there. But most of them seem to understand that, and the discussions I've had informally with them, and are supportive of that.
Good.
Councillor Gumichel, I can see you talking, but your mute button's on.
I was just trying to say thank you with them.
Okay.
Okay, good. Council, I think we're finished with that. Thank you, Mr. Spear. Again, tremendous work being done by our staff all through this, and we're completely confident that this will roll out in a reasonable fashion, and who knows what the future holds, but we've done very, very well up until now. So, Mr. Nopper, do we have some questions from the public?
Through you, your worship, we do have a few questions. I'm going to go to the Facebook questions here first. There was a question of, when looking at lighting, what about dark sky lighting controls? Something to consider. Another question came along with, was more of a comment, demolition or demolition permits demonstrates the need for a heritage bylaw. There was a question regarding, I believe it revolved around windows and the 40% transparency. Is that a minimum or a maximum? As we go through here, there are people that would be definitely interested in greater number of units being permitted in homes. So something to consider when you're looking at duplexes, triplexes, and other. There was a question about interested to know more details about setbacks from the high water mark on page 52 in regards to what the terms would be and what the Planning Advisory Committee use to consider necessary or for protecting properties and the environment. So they're looking for what guidelines would be associated with that. There was also questions about could that include seniors' homes in the definition, as they were thinking that would be great on Water Street. People were discussing the variances and wondering why the public constantly goes to variances as easy transitions versus just looking at the bylaw. Question came down to any distances within, and for variances, anybody that's within 200 feet was questioned and asked if they could be given notices if there is a variance change. Let's see. There was a question about, is there anything in the bylaw with respect to parking a mobile home in a driveway? Because there was discussion about not having mobile homes in towns at all. And the final question that I have from Facebook is, if a structure has been removed from a property for over 50 years, does a grandfathering still apply? And if someone wanted to rebuild that structure, even though it may not be allowed, is that allowed today? Those were the questions from online. And I'm just going to go to our one Zoom person. Thomas, if you wish, you can speak to council.
Thank
Thomas,
you.
you
I
have the
asked
floor
my
to council if you would like.
Council, I've asked my questions on Facebook.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
Other than that, council, those are the questions that were presented.
Okay, and you know, as I'm often heard saying at town hall, the reward for good work is good work. So it sounds like you can give most of those questions over to our planners for response. Thank you, planners.
Just your worship, if I may, is it possible for either the planners or town staff to ask those questions and then hit reply under the questions? Just because I'd hate to see someone sit on this meeting for 3 hours and we don't get back to them. And not that we would, but can we just assign someone to hit reply underneath them and answer other questions? And then if they have any concerns about it, they can bring it forward to council in an email or the hearing of objections.
Oh, you mean follow up after the meeting?
Well, yeah, because like,
Yeah.
how are they going to individually reach out to them? Like, I think they should hit reply maybe from the town or from the planner themselves. I don't know. I just think we owe it to those people to respond to all those questions.
Well, maybe we'll get an input from Mr. Knopper. What's the logistics and time?
Through your worship, I would recommend I will send the questions off to the planners for a response. Generally speaking, our planners get back to us pretty quickly, so I'm hoping within 24 to 48 hours, I think, is a reasonable response time when it comes to questions. So I will make sure that those questions are responded to appropriately.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Knopper. And I take your point, Deputy Mayor, that you know, in a live meeting, we would attempt at least to answer all the questions from people in the audience as goes through. This was a bit of a different kind of a meeting, though. It was more of a briefing. So we'll
Correct, Your Worship.
take that under advisement. Thanks, Deputy Mayor. I guess we could see if anybody has any further comments. Councillors, any comments or the meeting? I don't have any in particular myself at this point in time. It was an excellent meeting. I think we covered a lot of things, and we'll look forward to the next installment. So if no one has anything else that they need to say, I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
Move.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Grew seems to be chatting over there. Your
Yeah,
worship.
he's got his mic off.
Oh,
Your
Councillor
worship,
Grew,
apologize.
no,
I would suggest that we probably would want to go to evening meetings rather than the 2 o'clock. I think the evening works better for everyone.
I can,
Generally.
Yeah, no, we'll discuss, I'll discuss that with staff and make sure that, you know, I had made an assumption myself that there was some reason for today, but we'll try as much as we can to have early evening meetings as opposed to afternoon meetings. Yeah,
Thank you,
I agree.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, everyone. Take care.
Mayor, you still need a seconder for the motion to adjourn.
Oh,
please.
sorry. Councillor Groove seconded the motion.
Thank you.
All in favor?
Bye.
All right, we're adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Next week.